Ready for your next lesson?
Sure.
Okay. Now, your homework for yesterday was to work on 1 Samuel chapter 3, correct? Okay. Before we get there, let's just review a little bit. Over here we have our scene. On the left-hand side are the huts, which represent
Israel.
Okay? Or basically the time that the Old Testament, or the time that the Bible was written. Okay? And on the right is the city. And what's that represent?
Us today.
Right. Us today. People today. And in between is the river. What's that represent?
The differences.
Okay. The differences between the time of the Bible and our society today and us today. And it's difference of language, culture, time, place, covenant. And so the way to cross this river is we have to build a bridge, correct? And the two pillars for the bridge are human nature and God, because those two things don't change. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then yesterday, we looked at the steps to Old Testament narrative exegesis. And we put those steps all on the left-hand side here because they go with understanding what the Bible had to say to the people that it was written to originally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's the first step. We have to understand what the Bible meant to the people it was originally written to. Not just read it and go, well, what this means to me is, well, it wasn't written directly to you. It's for us, but it wasn't written directly to you. It was written to someone else, and they had a reason for writing it. So we have to understand what they intended in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a crazy example of that would be if I got the electric bill. And I looked at the electric bill and I go, well, what this means to me is that the electric company is going to pay me this much money. Well, it doesn't matter what it means to me. What matters is what the electric company meant when they wrote it. And they meant that I owe them that much money, right? Right. So it doesn't matter what it means to me, what interpretation I want to make out of it. I have to understand what the author intended when he wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
It would be nice if the electric company pays you to
that would be real
electricity.
nice. That would be real nice, but that's not the way things work. So, we have our 9 steps for narrative exegesis that we went over yesterday. And the first one is pray. Why do we pray?
To ask God to help us understand.
Help us understand and help us to apply it to our lives. Okay? Then we read before and after, which means?
Read what happens before and what happens after.
Okay. About how many chapters on each side?
5.
About 5 on each side. Right. Then we identify the boundaries, which means?
Identify, like, the beginning and the end of the story.
Okay, identify the beginning and end of the story and also the major sections of the story. And then, number 4, you look at the main characters, which means?
You identify the main characters.
Yeah, who's the story about, right? Then, number 5 is arrangement. What's that?
Like, where there's lots of action and where there's not so much.
Okay, basically, yeah, you're looking at the story itself and how's the story been put together, because those are some important things that give us clues as to what the writer was trying to teach us. Then we go for our focusing questions, and you haven't learned all of those yet, but what are 2 that you've learned?
What is the nature of God and what is human nature?
Just in general?
From the story.
Right, from the story. Then we have identify the ECI. What is the ECI?
The exegetical common idea?
Central idea.
Central idea.
Central idea, right. The exegetical central idea. And what does that refer to?
The main idea.
the main idea or the main point that the author was trying to show through the story. Now that's one thing about stories, is that the author usually doesn't say, this is the point of the story. He usually doesn't say that. He usually shows the point of the story. And so you have to look carefully to make sure that you're seeing what he's showing. So we put the ECI on the left-hand side of the bridge there, because all of our study of the passage leads us to identifying that central idea of the story, right? And then we go from ECI to TCI. What's TCI?
Theological central idea?
Right. It's a big term, theological central idea. And all it really means is that you've taken that idea from the story and you've made it into an idea that applies to all of God's people through all time. All cultures, all time. Then we go to the LCI, which is?
The lesson central idea.
The lesson central idea. And that's when we start applying it directly to us and to the people that we're teaching. And then we have connect. That is, we start making connections between their time and their situation and the story and us today. So those are the 9 steps. Now, what you were supposed to do was go through the first 7 steps with 1 Samuel chapter 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's what we're going to do. You prayed. I'm going to assume that you prayed. Did you? Good. And then you read before and after. Now, before we look further at whole passage and the 7 steps, I want to talk a little bit about what are we looking for when we read before and after. Here are some questions to answer. How do the surrounding chapters relate to your story? How does the chapters before connect to it? How do the chapters after connect to it? The next question is, in what social or religious setting did this story take place? What does that mean?
What was the situation?
The setting. Where was it? As far as social, was it in a palace? Was it in a hut? Was it out in the fields? What was the social setting? Then the religious setting is, was this among the Gentiles? Was this among the Jews? What's the religious setting of the story? Then, what is the geographical setting of the story? What place did it take place? At what place? Or we could say, where did it take place? Was it in Israel? Was it in Babylon? The more specific you can get, the better for understanding the story. And then finally, why do you think the author decided to tell this story? And we're asking a couple questions there. One, what made him select this story? Out of all the stories that he could have told, why did he choose this one? And secondly, why did he choose to put this story here? And why not somewhere else in the book? Do you understand? So those 4 questions we're going to look at, and I want you to be thinking about them as we go through step 2. So, tell me about step 2. You read, day before yesterday, you read chapters 1 and 2, and then yesterday you read 3 through 7, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, how do the surrounding chapters relate to your story?
Samuel is taken to the temple in the chapters before. In chapter 4, it shows the fulfillment of what God told Samuel.
Okay, good.
And then in chapter 7, it shows Samuel's leadership of Israel.
Okay.
I'm not sure about 5 and 6.
Okay, what's 5 and 6 about?
The Philistines having captured the ark and bringing it to Philistia.
To their country, yeah. Philistia.
And God sending tumors and mice to them, and so them getting rid of the ark.
Okay.
And sending it back to Israel.
Okay. Good. So how did chapters 1 and 2 connect to chapter 3? Well, you mentioned that Samuel was taken to the temple. Anything else?
In chapter 2, God sends the prophet to tell Eli what God told Samuel about the curse on their family.
Okay. So a prophet goes to Eli and tells him that God is going to curse your family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then in chapter 3, God tells Samuel the same message, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a connection there. Good. What's another connection?
Also in chapter 2, it tells about Eli's sons and how wicked they are.
Okay. Okay. Good. And that connects to chapter 3, which there's where God's saying, I'm going to punish them for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay. Good. So we're talking about how the surrounding chapters relate to your story. Now, some of the things we look for are repeated characters. Samuel is repeated all the way through. Hophni and Phinehas are mentioned. So is Eli, repeated through. Some other things that we look for would be repeated themes or statements or phrases. In chapter 2, verse 11, it says, Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's that about?
Samuel.
About Samuel. Then you go over to verse 18. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. Then you go to verse 21. Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. Jump down to verse 26. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. Then chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. Several times that key idea that Samuel was ministering to the Lord is found all through chapter 2, and then it starts off chapter 3. That's an important phrase. And as we get into chapter 3 a little further, we're going to see that. Okay. In what social or religious setting did this take place?
Well, it was in the temple.
It was in the temple. Good.
It was in Israel.
It was in Israel. Okay, so you're looking at the geographical setting of the story. Good.
Oh, yeah.
Where especially in
Jerusalem,
Israel?
I think.
Not Jerusalem.
Wasn't the temple in Jerusalem?
Gotta read carefully. Go back to chapter 1. Verse 3. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. Chapter 1, verse 24, at the end of verse 24, it says, well, she weaned him, she took him up with her, and it says she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. Where was the house of the Lord?
At Shiloh.
At Shiloh. It was not at Jerusalem at this time.
Except that doesn't really mean anything to me because I don't know about Shiloh.
Right. It doesn't mean anything to you yet. You might have to do some research on what's the significance of Shiloh. Why Shiloh? Well, I can tell you real quickly. Jerusalem was not yet in the hands of the Israelites. It belonged to the Jebusites. when the people of Israel conquered the land, the tabernacle was set up at Shiloh, and it was kept there at Shiloh until David moved it to Jerusalem. Okay, why do you think the author decided to tell this story?
To show how Samuel became a prophet.
Good. To show how Samuel became a prophet. Why do you think he decided to tell this story here? Was he just telling the stories in chronological order?
In this part, it seems like.
It is in chronological order, yes. Not every story in the Bible is in chronological order, though. But this one, yes, is in chronological order. But if you look, he's following Samuel's life. In chapter 1, you have Samuel being born. He's asked from the Lord. In fact, his name means asked, or God hears, Shemuel. He ministers before the Lord. Then there's a comparison all the way through chapter 2 of Samuel and Eli's worthless sons. Samuel, Eli's worthless sons. Then you have a prophet, a recognized prophet, give a prophecy to Eli. And then you come to chapter 3, and it says in verse 1, "And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision." Then you have the story about how God speaks to Samuel, and the story ends in verse 21 by saying, "And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord." So you have this story as a bridge story between what happens in chapter 2 with Hophni and Phinehas being wicked before the Lord, and Samuel being this boy who is serving in the house of the Lord faithfully. The prophet in chapter 2 comes to Eli and says, God is going to punish you. And then in chapter 4, God punishes Eli. But in chapter 3, God reiterates to Samuel what he has already said through the prophet. And in chapter 3 here, it serves as a hinge between chapters 2 and chapter 4, and showing that God has now taken Samuel and made him a prophet, and not the sons of Hophni and Phinehas. The sons of Eli, who are Hophni and Phinehas. Moving on to our exegesis steps, let's move on to number 3, identify the boundaries. Where do you think the story starts and stops?
Well, it starts in chapter 3, verse 1, and then you said it stops in verse 21, but I thought it stopped in verse 20.
Okay. Why did you think it stopped in verse 20?
I think because it just seemed like a good ending. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord.
Yeah, it's a good summary statement, isn't it? I think it continues beyond verse 21. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel. That's the first line of chapter 4. And I think that that's where the story actually ends. I think that concludes the summary. Good. Moving on, who are the main characters in this story? The human characters.
Samuel and Eli.
Samuel and Eli. Okay, who is the centermost character?
God, I think.
Human character.
Samuel.
Okay, the story is about Samuel. It starts by talking about Samuel. It ends by talking about Samuel. And the story is about how God revealed himself to Samuel. So those are the main characters. What do we learn about the main characters? What do we learn about Eli?
He is humble and accepting of God's punishment.
Okay, you're looking there at the end where in verse 18, he says, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. In verse 2 it says, at that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, that tells us that he was going blind.
Mm-hmm.
So he was older, going blind. Now, we also have to ask ourselves, why does the author give us that information? And we'll look at that a little bit later here. We also see that he did not recognize that God was calling Samuel at first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what do we learn about Samuel?
He's eager to obey Eli.
He's eager to obey Eli. How do you see that?
He comes quickly when he thinks Eli calls him.
Good. How old is Samuel?
A boy.
He's a boy. It just says he's a boy. Good. And then you also see that when God gives him the message, he's afraid to tell it to Eli. But when Eli says, tell me, he obeys Eli, right? So we see that he's an obedient boy. We also see, it says there, that Samuel was lying down. This is in verse 3. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. So where is he? He's in the presence of God. Arrangement. So what we're looking at here under arrangement is, what information does the author give us in this story, and how has he put the information together? When the authors wrote scripture, they didn't have a lot of paper. They were writing on different things like tablets of clay, or on skins of animals, maybe on papyrus, and there wasn't a lot of that to go around. There wasn't a lot of ink. It was a very laborious process. They didn't have a lot of space to just put in all sorts of interesting details. So they had to be very selective on what they wrote down. So every detail is actually important, even in stories. So we're looking to see what are the details, and especially what details kind of stand out to us as, why did he put that in there? So what do you see here?
At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see. It seems very irrelevant.
It seems irrelevant, right? Good. I don't think it's irrelevant. I think that the author selected that to point out, not only showing that Eli was old, but also pointing to his spiritual blindness. Because then you see that Eli doesn't recognize that God is calling Samuel. So you have the fact that Eli is physically blind, but I think the author is going beyond that to point out that he's also spiritually blind. His eyesight is growing dim. What other information do you see here?
The lamp of God had not yet gone out.
Okay, it's a strange statement, isn't it? The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Now in the tabernacle they had the lamp of God, the menorah, but it says the lamp of God had not yet gone out. That's just a strange statement. What's that got to do with anything?
It tells us the temple wasn't dark yet.
It tells it wasn't dark yet, so it was still light. What's going on? Well, it could also be symbolic, and we would have to do more research into that to see if they actually had a time when the lamp was supposed to be turned off or not, or whether he's symbolically saying God had not yet given up on Israel. Because it just said that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. But, in verse 3, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. I mentioned Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. He's in the presence of God. Where's Eli? Eli is lying down in his own place. Samuel is in the presence of God. So location is important there. Here's another one. Verse 7, it says, Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Now he says that after God calls Samuel twice, and Samuel thinks it's Eli. Why does he put that verse there? Why not right at the beginning before God calls Samuel? Why not give that explanation beforehand? Then it would completely make sense why Samuel runs to Eli. But he waits till after Samuel runs to Eli twice to tell us that Samuel had not been spoken to by the Lord. Why does he put that verse there? That's a question to ask. Why does he give Eli the last word in the story? It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. Why does he give Eli that last word? So these are things that you look at as far as arrangement and what's going on. Why does he put that there? Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Focusing questions. What are our two focusing questions?
What is the nature of God and what is human nature?
Good. Let's start with the vision of God in this story. What do we see about God in this story?
He is jealous.
Okay.
And often he takes vengeance.
Okay. Good. He's jealous and he takes vengeance. Now you're looking specifically at how he is dealing with Eli, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What else do you see about God here? He speaks to Samuel, right? So he speaks to people. You see in chapter 2 the contrast between Samuel and the sons of Eli. Samuel is serving the Lord. The sons of Eli are dishonoring the Lord. And in chapter 3 then, you see Samuel is a boy, Eli is a respected older priest. You see that God decides to speak through Samuel and give his message to Eli, his priest, through Samuel. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Why does God do that?
Because Eli has disobeyed him.
Good. Eli has disobeyed him, dishonored him. And yet, what has Samuel done?
He's not really done anything yet.
Well, we saw he's ministering to the Lord. 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 It shows him as a very faithful person, even as a little boy. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So here you see that God is someone who exalts one person and puts down another. We saw that in Hannah's song, right? But more specifically, who does he exalt?
People that obey him.
That obey him and honor him. And who does he put down?
People that don't obey him.
Okay. Is there a verse that you've read that's somewhere similar to that? Somewhat similar?
Chapter 2, the last part of verse 30. Those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed.
Right. Those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Now that's a key verse, not just for this story, but for the whole of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. That's like the theme verse all the way through. Now, what's the human nature that we see in this story?
Humans generally despise God.
Okay. Humans generally despise God, like Eli. But God lifts up those who honor him, right? Good. So let's come to the ECI. What did you come up with for the ECI, the central idea of the story?
Eli learned that God was a jealous God who sometimes takes vengeance.
Okay. Now you're focusing on Eli, but who's the main character of the story?
Samuel.
Samuel, right. So let's talk a little bit more about Samuel. But we can talk about Eli as well, because there's definitely a contrast in this story between Samuel and Eli. One is put down and one is exalted, right? And the one who does the main action in this story is actually the Lord, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we could even say something like, God honored Samuel, calling him to be his prophet, because Samuel was faithful to him, but dishonored Eli by condemning him because Eli dishonored God. Now that's a long ECI, and we could work on making it a little bit shorter, but that's the main idea. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So for homework, and those of you watching at home or following along, you can do this homework as well. Your homework is to look at chapters 4, 5, 6, and on into 7, and try to decide how many stories there are in those chapters. Is it 1 story, 2 stories, 3 stories? What are the boundaries? That's your homework. So we're moving from read before and after to identify the boundaries. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.